The Airbnb that wasn't empty. My girlfriend and I rented an Airbnb for a quiet weekend getaway, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The place looked perfect in the photos. A cozy house in the middle of the woods with a spacious porch and an interior that looked like it came straight out of Home Decor magazine. When we arrived, everything seemed normal, but right from the start, something felt off. The house had a strange smell, like it had been closed up for a long time, but at the same time, there was a faint scent of something fresh, as if someone had just cleaned. My girlfriend didn't notice anything unusual, and I decided to brush it off, thinking I was just overthinking things. But as we walk into the kitchen, I noticed a half-empty glass of water on the counter. It looked clean, as if it had been used recently. I asked her if she had left it there, but she laughed and said I must be imagining things. I tried to believe her, but I couldn't take my eyes off that glass. I went to the bathroom, and when I turned on the faucet, the water came out warm, like someone had just used a shower. My heart started racing, but I didn't want to scare my girlfriend, so I just joked that the water heater must be really good. She laughed again, but I was already feeling uneasy. Something about that house didn't add up. We tried to settle in, unpacking our bags and exploring the rest of the house. The living room was cozy, with a fireplace and large windows that let in plenty of natural light. But as we moved upstairs to the bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The floorboards creaked in a way that made me pause, like they were responding to more than just our footsteps. My girlfriend didn't seem to notice, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there. I told myself it was just an old house making old house noises, but the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. Later that evening, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard faint footsteps coming from the attic. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but definitely there, like someone was pacing slowly above us. My girlfriend froze, her eyes wide, and whispered, "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. We stood there for what felt like forever, listening until the sound stopped. She suggested it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but I wasn't convinced. The footsteps had a rhythm to them, too deliberate to be an animal. I tried to laugh it off, but neither of us slept well that night. Every little noise made me jump, and I kept imagining someone watching us from the shadows. The next morning, we woke up exhausted, the kind of tired that makes everything feel surreal. My girlfriend suggested we check out the attic to put our minds at ease, but I hesitated. The thought of climbing up there made my skin crawl, but I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I agreed. The attic access was in the ceiling of the hallway, with a pull-down ladder that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Dust floated in the air as we unfolded it, and the hinges squeaked loudly, making me wince. I went up first, my flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The attic was cramped and filled with old boxes, but what caught my attention was the corner of the room. There was a sleeping bag, neatly rolled up, and a few empty water bottles scattered nearby. My stomach dropped. Someone had been staying here. Recently, I called my girlfriend up to show her, and her face went pale. "What the hell?" she whispered, her voice trembling. We started looking through the boxes, hoping to find some explanation, but all we found were old clothes and random junk. Then I noticed something else. A small, almost invisible door in the wall, hidden behind a stack of boxes. It was barely big enough for a person to crawl through, and the latch was on the outside, like it was meant to keep something or someone in. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached for the latch, but my girlfriend grabbed my arm. "Don't," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if someone's in there?" I didn't know what to do. The air felt heavy, like the house itself was holding its breath. We decided to call the host, hoping for some kind of explanation. The phone rang several times before a cheerful voice answered, asking if everything was okay with the house. I tried to keep my voice steady as I described what we'd found: the sleeping bag, the water bottles, the hidden door. There was a long pause on the other end, and then the host laughed nervously. "Oh, that's probably just some old stuff left by the previous owners," she said. "The attic hasn't been cleaned out in years. Don't worry about it." Her tone was light, but it didn't match the tension in her voice. I wanted to believe her, but something about the way she brushed it off made me even more uneasy. My girlfriend and I exchanged a look, and I could tell she felt the same way. After the call, we debated what to do. Part of me wanted to leave right then and there, but my girlfriend insisted we stay. "We paid for this place," she said, trying to sound brave. "We're not letting some creepy attic ruin our weekend." I admired her determination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We spent the rest of the day trying to relax, but every little noise made us jump. At one point, I thought I heard faint scratching coming from the hidden door, but when I pressed my ear against it, there was only silence. My girlfriend suggested we lock the bedroom door that night, just in case, and I agreed. But as we lay in bed, listening to the wind howl outside, I couldn't help but wonder if the lock would be enough. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps again. This time, they weren't coming from the attic. They were in the hallway, right outside our door. My heart raced as I lay there, frozen, listening to the slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but the sound was too real, too close. I reached over to wake my girlfriend, but she was already awake, her eyes wide with fear. We didn't say a word, just stared at the door waiting. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn, slowly, as if someone was testing it. I held my breath, my entire body tense. The lock held, but the knob kept turning back and forth like whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't giving up. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, fading down the hallway. I waited a few minutes before getting up, my legs shaking as I tiptoed to the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening, but all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. My girlfriend whispered, "What are you doing?" But I didn't answer. I unlocked the door and peeked out, the hallway dark and empty. The attic ladder was still down, swaying slightly, as if someone had just climbed up. I wanted to close it, to lock it, but I couldn't bring myself to get any closer. Instead, I shut the bedroom door and locked it again, my hands trembling. We didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting up in bed, staring at the door, waiting for the footsteps to return. The next morning, we packed our things as quickly as we could, not even bothering to make coffee or eat breakfast. The house felt different in the daylight, less menacing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we carried our bags to the car, I glanced back at the house one last time. For a split second, I thought I saw a face in the attic window, pale and expressionless, just staring down at us. I blinked and it was gone. My girlfriend asked me what was wrong, but I just shook my head, not wanting to scare her any more than she already was. We got in the car and drove away, neither of us saying a word until we were miles down the road, that we never reported what happened to the host or left a review. Part of me felt like we should warn others, but the other part just wanted to forget it ever happened. To this day, I don't know who or what was in that house with us. Sometimes, I wonder if they're still there, waiting for the next guest to arrive. My girlfriend and I don't talk about it much, but every now and then when the house comes up in conversation, we exchange a look and I know we're both thinking the same thing. We got out, but not everyone might be so lucky. The Airbnb with a second guest bouquet were so excited for this weekend trip. 6 of us had rented this trendy urban loft through Airbnb, and the photos made it look like something out of a design magazine. Exposed brick walls, industrial lighting, and this huge open floor plan that felt both cozy and luxurious. When we arrived, the place didn't disappoint. It was even better in person. We spent the first hour just exploring, laughing, and claiming our spots. But then, as we were settling in, someone noticed the guest book on the coffee table. It was this sleek, leather-bound book, the kind you'd expect in a place like this. We thought it'd be fun to flip through and see what other guests had written. That's when things started to feel off. The first few entries were normal, people praising the decor, thanking the host, the usual stuff. But as we kept reading, the tone shifted. One entry just said, "Don't stay after dark." Another read, "They're watching from the walls." At first, we laughed it off, thinking it was some kind of inside joke or a prank by the host. But the more we read, the more unsettling it got. There were mentions of strange noises, shadows moving where they shouldn't, and one person even wrote, "I couldn't sleep. Something was in the room with me." We tried to brush it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The cheerful vibe of the loft suddenly felt forced, like it was hiding something. Later that afternoon, while we were unpacking, one of my friends, Jess, found something strange. She was looking for extra blankets in the living room cabinet and stumbled across a second guest book. This one was different, smaller, with a worn-out cover, like it had been hidden there for a while. We gathered around as she opened it, and the first thing that hit me was the handwriting. It was messy, almost frantic, like the person was in a hurry or scared. The entries were nothing like the ones in the first guest book. People wrote about hearing whispers at night, seeing figures in the corners of their eyes, and one person even claimed they found a hidden camera in the bathroom. But the entry that made my blood run cold was from someone who said they never checked out. They wrote, "I'm still here. They won't let me leave." We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some elaborate prank by the host, or maybe the previous guests were just messing with people. But the more we talked about it, the more uneasy we felt. Jess suggested we check for cameras, just to be safe. We split up and started searching the loft, behind paintings, inside vents, even under furniture. That's when we found it. In the corner of the bedroom ceiling, tucked into the molding, was a small, black device. It wasn't obvious unless you were really looking for it, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. It was a camera, and it was pointed right at the bed. We all froze. Someone was watching us that we didn't know what to do. Part of us wanted to leave right then and there, but it was already getting dark, and none of us had a plan for where to go. We decided to cover the camera with a piece of tape and keep searching the loft to see if there were more. It felt like we were in some kind of twisted game, and the rules kept changing. As we moved through the space, the atmosphere shifted. The loft, which had felt so warm and inviting earlier, now felt cold and oppressive. Every creak of the floorboards made us jump, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. By the time we finished searching, we found 2 more cameras, one in the living room and another in the hallway. We covered them all, but it didn't make us feel any better. If anything, it made things worse. Who had put them there? And why? The guest book entries kept replaying in my mind, especially the one about the person who never checked out. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in the loft. We tried to lighten the mood by ordering pizza and putting on a movie, but no one could focus. Every little noise, the hum of the fridge, the wind against the windows, felt like a warning. We were all on edge, and the night was just beginning. Around midnight, things got worse. We were all sitting in the living room, trying to distract ourselves, when we heard it, a faint knocking sound. At first, we thought it was coming from the door, but when we checked, no one was there. The knocking continued, though, and it seemed to be coming from inside the walls. It was soft but deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get our attention. We all fell silent, staring at each other, unsure of what to do. Jess grabbed her phone and started recording, as if having proof would make it less terrifying. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, and then it stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost worse, that we tried to convince ourselves it was just the building settling or pipes rattling. But deep down, none of us believed that. The energy in the loft had changed. It felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on us. We decided to stay together in the living room, too scared to sleep in the bedrooms. We turned on all the lights and kept the TV playing softly in the background, hoping it would make us feel safer. But every time one of us dozed off, something would jolt us awake. A sudden noise, a flicker of the lights, or the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing at the walls, half expecting to see eyes staring back at me. The guest book warnings were no longer funny. They felt like a desperate plea we should have taken seriously. By 3 a.m. We were all exhausted but too scared to sleep. That's when we noticed the temperature dropping. It wasn't just a little chilly, it was freezing, like the loft had suddenly become a refrigerator. We wrapped ourselves in blankets and huddled closer together, but the cold seemed to seep into our bones. And then we heard it again. This time it wasn't knocking. It was a voice, faint, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere in the loft. We couldn't make out what it was saying, but it sounded desperate, like someone pleading for help. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. None of us moved. We just sat there, frozen in fear, listening to that voice drift through the air. The voice stopped as suddenly as it had started, and for a moment, there was silence. Then we heard footsteps, clear, unmistakable footsteps, pacing back and forth in the hallway. My stomach dropped. We were all in the living room. No one was in the hallway. Jess grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and we all stared at the doorway, waiting for something to appear. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped right outside the living room. My breath caught in my chest. The door creaked open slowly, but there was no one there. Just an empty hallway, bathed in the dim glow of the overhead light. And then the light flickered and went out. We didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound, every shadow kept us on edge. When the sun finally rose, it felt like a miracle. The loft looked normal again, bright, modern, and inviting. But none of us could shake the feeling that something was still wrong. We packed up our things as quickly as we could, not even bothering to clean up. As we were leaving, I noticed something on the coffee table. The first guest book was open to a new page, one we hadn't seen before. Scrawled in messy handwriting were the words, "You shouldn't have come back." My stomach turned. We hadn't touched the guest book since the first night. Who had written that? We left the keys on the counter and got out of there as fast as we could. On the drive home, no one spoke much. We were all too shaken to process what had happened. When we got back, I tried to contact the host to ask about the guest books and the cameras, but the listing had been taken down. It was like the loft had never existed. I still don't know what happened that weekend. Were the cameras real? Was the voice? I can't explain any of it, but I do know one thing. I'll never stay in an Airbnb again without checking for a second guest book first. And if I ever find one, I'm running the other way that I've tried to rationalize it all. Maybe it was an elaborate prank, or maybe we were just tired and paranoid. But deep down, I know what we experienced was real. The guest books, the cameras, the voice, the footsteps, it all happened. And the worst part is, I can't stop thinking about that last entry in the guest book. You shouldn't have come back. What did it mean? Were we not the first group to stay there and experience something like this? Or was it a warning meant for someone else entirely? I'll never know. The loft, the host, the guest books, it's all gone now like it never existed. But I can't forget it. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that faint knocking in my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I'm back in that loft, staring at the walls, waiting for something to move. I don't talk about it much anymore because no one would believe me. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. And I know this. Some places aren't meant to be rented, and some guest books aren't meant to be read. Whatever was in that loft, it's still there. Watching, waiting, and I can't help but wonder, who's staying there now? The Airbnb with the unlisted room by the second night. My curiosity had gotten the better of me. The noises were back, louder this time, like someone was moving things around behind that door. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the sounds were too real. I even recorded them on my phone, just to prove I wasn't going crazy. The next morning, I decided to confront the host again. I called and asked about the door, but they sounded annoyed and repeated the same line. It's just a storage room. Don't worry about it. Their tone made me even more suspicious. Why were they so defensive about a storage room? I started to feel like I was being watched, even though I was completely alone in the cottage. That afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I found an old bobby pin in my bag and decided to try picking the lock. I'd never done anything like that before, but desperation makes you do strange things. After a few frustrating minutes, I heard the click. My hand was shaking as I turned the handle and pushed the door open. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't a storage room. It was a fully furnished bedroom. The bed was neatly made, clothes were folded on a chair, and there were personal items scattered around. A toothbrush on the nightstand, a pair of shoes by the bed, and even a half-empty glass of water. But what really terrified me was the calendar on the wall. It had the current month, and someone had circled the dates of my stay. Whoever stayed here knew I was coming. I stood there frozen, staring at the calendar. My mind was racing. Who had been staying here? And why were they keeping track of my visit? I felt a wave of nausea as I realized the implications. This wasn't just some random storage room. It was someone's space, someone who clearly knew I'd be here. I started looking around, trying to find any clues. The clothes were modern, not old or dusty, which meant someone had been here recently. I opened the drawers and found more personal items, a wallet with no ID, a notebook filled with scribbled notes, and a set of keys. My hands were trembling as I flipped through the notebook, but the writing was too messy to make out. The whole room felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I wasn't supposed to see. That I decided to call the host again. But this time, there was no answer. I left a voicemail, my voice shaking as I demanded an explanation. As I hung up, I heard a noise from the main part of the cottage, a soft thud, like something had fallen. My heart leapt into my throat. I hadn't heard anyone come in, and I was sure I was alone. I grabbed the keys from the drawer and crept back to the hallway, peeking around the corner. Everything looked normal, but the air felt heavier, like the cottage itself was holding its breath. I locked the bedroom door behind me, not sure if I was trying to keep something out or in. That's when I noticed something else. The faint smell of smoke, like someone had just blown out a candle. But there were no candles in the cottage. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every little sound. The smell of smoke lingered, but I couldn't find its source. I checked every room, even the fireplace, but there was nothing. By nightfall, I was exhausted but too scared to sleep. I locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one, and sat on the couch with my phone in hand, ready to call for help if anything happened. The noises from the locked room had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. It felt like the calm before a storm, like something was waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Around midnight, I heard it again, the shuffling sound, but this time it wasn't coming from the locked room. It was in the hallway, just outside the living room. My breath caught in my throat, as I slowly turned my head toward the doorway. The hallway was dark, but I could see a shadow moving, just barely, like someone was standing there, watching me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I gripped my phone tighter, my fingers trembling as I tried to unlock it to call for help. That's when the shadow moved again, stepping closer. I could see the outline of a person now, but their face was hidden in the darkness. I finally found my voice and shouted, "Who's there?" The figure stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then, without a word, they turned and walked back down the hallway, disappearing into the dark that I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed on the couch, clutching a kitchen knife I'd grabbed for protection, my eyes glued to the hallway. The shadow didn't return, but the feeling of being watched never went away. When the sun finally rose, I felt a small sense of relief, but it didn't last long. I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't leave without answers. I went back to the locked room, my heart pounding as I opened the door again. Everything was exactly as I left it, except for one thing. The glass of water on the nightstand was now full. I stared at it, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. I hadn't touched it, and there was no way anyone could have come in without me noticing. Or so I thought. I'd pack my things as quickly as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip up my bag. As I was leaving, I noticed something else, a piece of paper on the kitchen counter that hadn't been there before. It was a note, written in the same messy handwriting as the notebook in the locked room. All it said was, "You shouldn't have come." I dropped the note like it had burned me and bolted out the door, not even bothering to lock it behind me. I didn't look back as I drove away, my mind racing with questions I knew I'd never get answers to. Who was in that room? Why were they watching me? And what would have happened if I'd stayed longer? I reported everything to the rental company, but they seemed just as confused as I was. They contacted the host, who claimed they had no idea what I was talking about. They even sent someone to check the cottage, but when they did, the locked room was empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, nothing. Just a bare, dusty room that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The host insisted it had always been a storage room and accused me of making up the story. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Had I imagined it all? But I had the recording of the noises, the photos I'd taken of the room, and the note. They were real, weren't they? I still don't have an explanation for what happened, and it haunts me to this day. I've tried to move on, but I can't shake the feeling that something or someone was in that cottage with me. I keep thinking about the calendar, the full glass of water, and the shadow in the hallway. Whoever was there knew I was coming, and they didn't want me to find out the truth. I'll never go back to that place, but I can't stop wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed longer. Was I in danger, or was it something else entirely? I'll probably never know, but one thing's for sure, I'll never rent a countryside cottage again.